This is an emergency health inspection. You have to leave immediately." Building owner Reginald Ashford burst through the door of apartment 3A, his clipboard trembling slightly in the morning light as he gestured wildly at imaginary hazards throughout Calvin Brooks's spotless home. His blue jacket hung open over his green polo, revealing sweat stains despite the cool morning air streaming through the open windows that showcased the immaculate living space. Calvin's wife Zara stood in her red dress, arms crossed, as she watched Ashford frantically photograph clean walls while claiming structural damage, his desperation obvious to everyone except himself. The fluorescent kitchen lights illuminated every perfect surface as Ashford's voice grew more shrill, insisting on immediate evacuation for problems that clearly didn't exist. What Ashford couldn't see was the small federal recording device Zara wore like jewelry, or the fact that Calvin had been photographing similar emergency inspections at 6 other properties over the past 4 months, all targeting Black and Latino families with fabricated violations that would crumble under federal scrutiny. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. Calvin Brooks maintained his calm composure as Ashford continued his theatrical performance, snapping photos of pristine white walls while muttering about structural damage that existed only in his imagination. The morning sun streamed through the living room windows, casting natural light across the immaculate hardwood floors that Calvin and Zara had spent their weekend cleaning. Calvin wore his navy blue jeans and white t-shirt, the same casual outfit he'd worn to blend in as just another tenant during their months-long undercover operation. "Mr. Ashford," Calvin said, his voice steady and measured, "I'm going to need to see some documentation for this inspection. What specific violations are you claiming?" Ashford's hands trembled more noticeably as he fumbled with his phone camera, taking pictures of the spotless kitchen counters while claiming to document health hazards. His receding hairline glistened with perspiration despite the comfortable temperature, and his pale complexion had taken on a sickly sheen that made his desperation even more apparent. "Documentation? I don't need documentation for emergency health violations," Ashford snapped, his voice cracking slightly. "This is my building, and I have every right to inspect for dangerous conditions." Zara stepped forward, her red blouse catching the fluorescent light as she positioned herself to get a better angle with the hidden recording device. Her black slacks and professional demeanor gave her an air of authority that clearly made Ashford uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite identify why. "But this is very sudden, Mr. Ashford," Zara said, her tone perfectly balanced between concerned tenant and questioning authority. "We've lived here for 4 months without any problems. What changed overnight that requires emergency evacuation?" Calvin watched Ashford's reaction carefully, noting how the man's left eye twitched when pressed for specific details. After 4 months of documenting similar scenes at other properties, Calvin recognized the signs of a landlord fabricating violations on the spot. The pattern was always the same: sudden emergency inspections targeting minority families, followed by immediate eviction notices based on problems that conveniently appeared overnight. Ashford moved to the bathroom, where the overhead fluorescent lights revealed pristine white tiles and spotless fixtures. He aimed his phone at the perfectly functioning sink while claiming plumbing violations, his voice growing more agitated with each passing minute. "There's extensive water damage behind these walls," Ashford declared, though the walls showed no signs of moisture or discoloration, "and the electrical system is completely unsafe. You could be electrocuted at any moment." Calvin exchanged a subtle glance with Zara, both of them recognizing the absurdity of the claims. The electrical work had been updated just 2 years ago, and they had the inspection certificates to prove it. More importantly, they had documentation showing Ashford had approved their lease application despite knowing about any existing conditions. If the electrical system is dangerous, why did you rent us the apartment? Calvin asked, pulling out his copy of the lease agreement. According to this document, you certified that all systems were in safe working condition when we signed. For a moment, Ashford's composure slipped entirely. His face flushed red, and his hands shook so violently that he nearly dropped his phone. Calvin could see sweat stains spreading across the back of Ashford's green polo shirt as the man struggled to maintain his fabricated narrative. That was before the problems developed, Ashford stammered, clearly improvising. These issues can appear suddenly, and as the property owner, I have a responsibility to protect my tenants. Zara discreetly activated the camera function on her own phone, capturing images of Ashford photographing non-existent damage while his claims grew increasingly desperate. The natural skylight from the bathroom window provided perfect illumination for documenting his fraudulent evidence gathering. What specific code violations are you documenting? Zara pressed, her professional training evident in how she guided Ashford into creating more evidence of his deception. We'd like to understand exactly what dangers you're claiming exist. Ashford moved back to the living room, where the combination of fluorescent lighting and natural sunlight made the apartment's excellent condition undeniable. He pointed at perfectly intact walls while claiming structural damage, photographed spotless carpets while insisting on health hazards, and gestured at functioning light fixtures while declaring electrical emergencies. Calvin noticed how Ashford avoided making eye contact, instead focusing obsessively on his clipboard and phone, as if they could somehow validate his fabricated claims. The man's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested he was operating under extreme stress. Mr. Ashford, Calvin said, stepping closer so Zara's recording device could capture every word clearly. Are you saying that all these problems developed overnight? Because we were here yesterday evening and everything was perfectly normal. Problems like this don't announce themselves, Ashford replied, his voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. By the time tenants notice structural damage or electrical hazards, it could be too late. I'm trying to save your lives here. The irony wasn't lost on Calvin and Zara. After months of documenting Ashford's systematic targeting of minority families, they were watching him create his most elaborate fabrication yet, completely unaware that every word and action was being recorded for federal prosecutors. Ashford pulled out a pre-printed eviction notice, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold the pen to fill in the details. Calvin watched as the man fabricated violation codes on the spot, inventing health and safety issues that would never survive professional inspection. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises, Ashford announced, attempting to inject authority into his voice despite the obvious panic in his eyes. This is for your own safety and the safety of other tenants in the building. Zara stepped forward, positioning herself to get the best possible documentation of the fraudulent eviction notice. 24 hours seems very extreme for problems you claim developed suddenly. Shouldn't we have time to verify these violations with city inspectors? Ashford's composure cracked further at the mention of official inspectors. His face drained of what little color remained, and Calvin could see actual tremors running through his hands as he clutched the clipboard. The violations are clear and present dangers, Ashford insisted, though his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Any delay could result in serious injury or death. I won't have that responsibility on my conscience. Calvin almost smiled at the man's reference to conscience, knowing that Ashford had systematically displaced dozens of families without any apparent moral concerns. The federal investigation had revealed a pattern of discriminatory evictions designed to push out minority tenants and raise rents through gentrification. We understand your position, Mr. Ashford, Calvin said diplomatically, maintaining the perfect balance of concerned tenant and cooperative victim. But surely you can provide us with the specific municipal codes you're citing. We just want to understand what we're dealing with." Ashford's response was to thrust the eviction notice at Calvin with shaking hands before backing toward the door. His desperation had reached a crescendo, and even he seemed to recognize that his performance was falling apart under the slightest scrutiny. 24 hours, Ashford repeated, his voice barely audible as he fumbled with the door handle. "If you're not out by tomorrow at this time, I'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement." As the door closed behind Ashford, Calvin and Zara remained perfectly still for several minutes, maintaining their tenant personas until they were certain he was gone. The morning light continued to stream through their windows, illuminating an apartment so pristine it could have been featured in a magazine. Calvin looked at the fraudulent eviction notice, noting every fabricated violation code and impossible deadline. After 4 months of building their federal case, they had just witnessed Ashford's most brazen attempt at illegal eviction yet. What he didn't know was that his desperation had just triggered the final phase of a federal investigation that would bring his entire discriminatory operation crashing down. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead as Calvin and Zara exchanged a look of quiet satisfaction. Tomorrow, when Ashford returned expecting to find another family destroyed by his illegal tactics, he would instead discover that he had been targeting federal investigators for months. The evidence was overwhelming, the case was airtight, and justice was less than 24 hours away. The fluorescent lights in Calvin and Zara's apartment cast everything in stark clarity as they sat at their small dining table, surrounded by 4 months of carefully documented evidence. Calvin Brooks adjusted his green polo shirt and leaned back in his chair, watching his wife Zara organize photographs with methodical precision. Her red blouse caught the overhead light as she moved, sorting images into neat piles that told a story of systematic abuse spanning 6 different properties. "Look at this pattern," Zara said, her voice tight with controlled anger. She spread out rental applications across the table's surface. Every single minority family that applied to Ashford's properties received the same response within 48 hours. Sudden lease violations, emergency inspections, immediate eviction notices. Calvin picked up a photograph of Mrs. Dorothy Washington, an elderly black woman whose weathered face showed the strain of displacement. He remembered their first interview with her 3 months ago, how she'd trembled in her blue jacket as she recounted Reginald Ashford's lies. The memory came flooding back with crystal clarity. They had met Mrs. Washington at a community center on a bright Tuesday morning, natural light streaming through tall windows as she sat across from them in a folding chair. Her hands shook as she explained how Ashford had burst into her apartment, claiming pet violations. "I never owned a pet in my life," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Been allergic to cats and dogs since I was a child." But he had photographs. Official-looking documents said the city inspector found evidence of animals destroying the property. Calvin had leaned forward in his orange shirt, his voice gentle but probing. "Did you ask to see the specific violations?" He wouldn't let me look at nothing properly, just kept shouting about health hazards and lease agreements. Had that property manager woman with him, Linda something, taking more pictures of my clean apartment, like it was some kind of crime scene. Zara had discreetly recorded the entire conversation, building their federal case one testimony at a time. Now, months later, she pulled out her phone and played back portions of that interview, Mrs. Washington's voice filling their current apartment with painful truth. Calvin's jaw tightened as he remembered their second major interview with Marcus Johnson, a young father who'd been evicted for fabricated noise complaints. They'd met Marcus at a park on a sunny afternoon, his 2 young children playing nearby while he recounted Ashford's harassment campaign. The man showed up at 7 in the morning, Marcus had said, his green t-shirt and blue jeans rumpled from another sleepless night in temporary housing. Claimed neighbors were complaining about loud music, parties, disrupting the peace. "My kids are 3 and 5 years old. We're in bed by 8:30 every night. Zara had asked the crucial question that revealed Ashford's method. Did he show you the specific complaints? Said he had them in his office. But the violations were so severe, he couldn't wait for normal business hours. Gave me 72 hours to vacate or face legal action. When I asked which neighbors complained, he got real aggressive. Started talking about lawsuits and damages. Calvin shuffled through more photographs, each one documenting the same systematic approach across different properties. Ashford would target families during application reviews, waiting until they were settled and vulnerable, then manufacture violations that justified immediate eviction proceedings. He's not just discriminating, Zara said, pulling up property records on her laptop. He's running a calculated operation to push out minority families and replace them with higher-paying tenants. Look at these rental rates. The screen displayed a damning pattern. Every property where Ashford had conducted his fabricated evictions showed immediate rent increases of 30 to 50%. New tenants were predominantly white, with significantly higher income requirements and additional security deposits that effectively barred minority families from reapplying. Calvin stood and walked to their window, afternoon sunlight streaming across his face as he processed the scope of Ashford's criminal enterprise. 4 months of evidence, 6 properties, dozens of families displaced through systematic fraud. We've documented enough federal violations to put him away for decades. Their HUD investigation had begun as a routine discrimination complaint, but the evidence they'd gathered revealed something far more sinister. Reginald Ashford wasn't just a prejudiced landlord making impulsive decisions. He was running a sophisticated operation designed to circumvent fair housing laws while maximizing profit through illegal displacement. Zara joined Calvin at the window, her red blouse bright against the natural light. The connection to Thomas Wright makes it even worse. A city inspector, providing official cover for fraudulent violations, turns this into a federal conspiracy case. They had discovered Wright's involvement during their 3rd month of investigation. The corrupt inspector would arrive with Ashford, lending government authority to completely fabricated building code violations. His short-sleeved uniform and official clipboard made Ashford's lies seem legitimate to frightened families facing immediate homelessness. Calvin returned to the table and pulled out a thick folder labeled Financial Analysis. Inside were bank records, property transfers, and rental agreements that revealed Ashford's true motivations. He inherited these properties from his father 5 years ago. Since then, he's systematically displaced over 200 minority families while doubling his rental income. The numbers told a story of calculated greed. Ashford's properties were located in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods where market rates could support much higher rents. Rather than wait for natural tenant turnover, he manufactured violations to force immediate evictions, then marketed the same apartments at premium prices to different demographic groups. Zara opened another laptop and began cross-referencing their evidence with federal housing databases. The timing isn't coincidental either. HUD investigations in 3 neighboring districts over the past year have landlords scared. Ashford's rushing to maximize profits before federal oversight increases. This explained Ashford's increasingly desperate behavior, his trembling hands, and obvious anxiety during yesterday's fabricated inspection. He knew federal investigators were closing in on housing discrimination across the metropolitan area, making his continued operation extremely risky. Calvin organized photographs from their undercover documentation, each image carefully dated and cataloged for federal prosecution. Linda Hayes is the key to his entire operation. She provides administrative cover, processes the fraudulent paperwork, coordinates with Wright on fake inspections. Property manager Linda Hayes had appeared at every illegal eviction they'd witnessed or documented. Her professional demeanor and official position gave Ashford's lies credibility with victims who didn't understand their legal rights or federal protections. Zara pulled up email communications they had intercepted between Hayes and Wright, revealing the depth of their coordinated conspiracy. Look at these messages. They're scheduling fake inspections, coordinating violation reports, even discussing which families to target based on income levels and race. The electronic evidence was devastating. Hayes and Wright had created a systematic process for manufacturing violations, complete with template documents and predetermined timelines for forced evictions. Their communications revealed conscious intent to discriminate, making federal prosecution straightforward. Calvin felt righteous anger building as he reviewed testimonies from displaced families, children forced to change schools, elderly residents losing stable housing, young families pushed into financial crisis through illegal practices that violated everything fair housing laws were designed to prevent. Tomorrow's eviction attempt is going to be his biggest mistake, Zara said, her voice carrying quiet determination. He thinks we're just another vulnerable family he can intimidate and displace. Instead, he's walking into federal agents who've spent 4 months documenting his every crime. They had carefully orchestrated this final confrontation, ensuring Ashford would commit his violations in front of federal investigators while believing he was targeting helpless tenants. His arrogance and desperation would combine to create overwhelming evidence of systematic housing discrimination. Calvin closed the financial analysis folder and looked directly at his wife. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Zara's smile carried both professional satisfaction and personal conviction. "We've built an airtight case. Property records, victim testimonies, financial evidence, electronic communications, documented patterns across multiple locations. Ashford's entire criminal operation is about to collapse." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their evidence-covered table as Calvin and Zara Brooks prepared for the final phase of their HUD investigation. Tomorrow, Reginald Ashford would discover that his systematic campaign of housing discrimination had targeted the very federal agents tasked with stopping him. Their 4 months of undercover work, documented abuse, and carefully gathered evidence would finally deliver justice for Mrs. Dorothy Washington, Marcus Johnson, and dozens of other families whose lives had been destroyed by Ashford's criminal enterprise. Calvin gathered the photographs while Zara secured their electronic files, both investigators ready to spring the trap that would end Ashford's pattern of abuse forever. The early morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the federal building as Calvin Brooks adjusted his green polo shirt and walked purposefully down the polished corridor. The overhead fluorescent lights created perfect illumination as he approached conference room 304, where Detective Maria Santos waited with a spread of surveillance equipment across the mahogany table. "Calvin, right on time," Detective Santos said, her muscular frame evident beneath her crisp federal uniform as she gestured toward the array of micro-cameras and recording devices. "Zara's already briefed me on yesterday's fabricated inspection. This is exactly the aggressive move we've been waiting for." Calvin nodded, his professional focus sharp as he examined the technical setup. Reginald's desperation is showing. 24 hours to vacate based on violations that don't exist? He's getting reckless, which means he's vulnerable. Zara Brooks entered the conference room wearing her signature red blouse and dark pants, carrying a laptop loaded with digital evidence. Her expression showed the same controlled intensity that had made their 4-month undercover operation so successful. "I've been analyzing Reginald's pattern since 3 a.m., she said, opening the laptop to reveal a detailed timeline of discriminatory evictions. "This isn't just about us anymore. He's accelerating his timeline across all properties." Detective Santos leaned forward, her short-sleeved uniform reflecting her no-nonsense approach to federal investigations. "What's driving the acceleration?" Calvin pulled up a chair as Zara clicked through financial documents they'd secretly photographed. "We ran background checks through HUD databases overnight. Reginald Ashford inherited 12 properties from his father in 2019, all in neighborhoods experiencing rapid gentrification. Within 18 months, he'd systematically removed every minority family through fabricated lease violations." The disgust in Calvin's voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable. Zara continued the briefing, pulling up bank records that revealed Reginald's true motivations. His financial situation is worse than we initially thought. He's been using discriminatory evictions to flip properties to higher-income white tenants, increasing rent by 200 to 300%. The profits have been funding his lifestyle and covering gambling debts. Detective Santos studied the financial data with growing anger. So minority families lose their homes to subsidize his personal problems? It gets worse, Calvin said, accepting a secure tablet from Zara. We discovered his social media accounts last night. He's been documenting his evictions like trophies. The tablet screen showed screenshots of Reginald's private social media posts, each one more damning than the last. Photos of eviction notices with captions celebrating another successful removal. Racist comments about tenants who dared to challenge his authority. Most disturbing were his bragging posts about using City Inspector Thomas Wright and property manager Linda Hayes to create official-looking violations. Zara's professional composure couldn't hide her revulsion as she scrolled through the evidence. He posted about Mrs. Dorothy Washington's eviction like it was entertainment, called her a stubborn old woman who finally learned her place. She's 78 years old and had lived in that apartment for 12 years. The conference room fell silent as the full scope of Reginald's cruelty became clear. Calvin closed the tablet and looked directly at Detective Santos. This isn't just housing discrimination anymore. This is systematic, psychological warfare against vulnerable families. Detective Santos stood and walked to the window overlooking the federal courthouse where Attorney General Patricia Coleman was preparing legal strategy. Patricia wants to meet with you both in 30 minutes. She's been building the federal case since your first evidence reports, but yesterday's fabricated inspection gives us everything we need for criminal charges. Calvin and Zara exchanged glances, their anticipation building as months of careful work approached its culmination. The sting operation they'd been planning was about to become reality. 30 minutes later, they sat in Attorney General Patricia Coleman's office, where natural light from tall windows combined with overhead fluorescence to create an atmosphere of official authority. Patricia Coleman, wearing a professional blue jacket, reviewed their evidence files with the focused attention of someone preparing for a high-profile prosecution. "Your documentation is exceptional," she said, lifting her eyes from a thick folder of photographs and recordings. 4 months of systematic evidence collection across 6 properties, testimony from 14 displaced families, financial records proving discriminatory profit motives, and now yesterday's attempted illegal eviction caught on hidden camera. Calvin leaned forward, his green shirt contrasting with the formal office environment. "What's our legal strategy when Reginald makes his next move?" Attorney General Coleman smiled with the confidence of someone holding overwhelming evidence. "We let him complete his violation of federal housing law while federal agents document every moment. The instant he attempts to execute that fabricated eviction notice, he transforms from a discriminatory landlord into a federal criminal." Zara opened her laptop to show the technical surveillance setup they'd prepared. "We've positioned micro cameras throughout our apartment and common areas. Every false claim, every fabricated violation, every illegal threat will be recorded in high definition with audio." More importantly, Detective Santos added, checking her secure phone, "We have federal teams positioned around all of Reginald's properties. The moment he triggers the sting operation, we simultaneously execute search warrants and arrest warrants for his entire network." Calvin felt controlled excitement building as the scope of their operation became clear. Thomas Wright and Linda Hayes, already under federal surveillance, Attorney General Coleman confirmed. Wright's been taking bribes to falsify inspection reports for 2 years. Hayes has been systematically targeting minority rental applications and fabricating lease violations. When Reginald falls, his entire corrupt network falls with him. The afternoon passed quickly as federal teams coordinated their positioning. Calvin and Zara returned to their apartment, where they maintained their tenant personas while secretly preparing for Reginald's final violation. The fluorescent lighting in their hallway seemed brighter as they discussed their performance strategy. "Remember, we need to appear desperate, but not suspicious," Calvin reminded Zara as they entered their spotless apartment. "Reginald's confidence is his weakness. The more powerful he feels, the more evidence he'll create." Zara checked the hidden camera positions one final time. "I've been thinking about his psychology. He's not just evicting people for profit anymore. He's addicted to the power dynamic. Watching families beg and plead feeds something dark in him." Calvin nodded, understanding how Reginald's cruelty had evolved beyond simple greed. "Which means he'll want to savor our apparent defeat. He'll take time to explain our powerlessness, document our desperation, maybe even call Linda Hayes to witness another successful eviction." As evening approached, they began their performance. Calvin called his brother in Chicago, actually federal agent Marcus Williams, speaking loudly enough for any surveillance to overhear. "Man, we got 24 hours to find a new place. This landlord is claiming violations that don't exist. But what can we do? We can't afford lawyers." Zara paced the apartment, her red blouse catching the overhead light as she made her own staged phone calls. "Mom, I know you warned us about renting in this neighborhood, but we thought we found a good place. Now this man is trying to throw us out with one day's notice." Their performances were convincing because they channeled the genuine desperation they'd witnessed in Mrs. Dorothy Washington, Marcus Johnson, and 13 other families who'd suffered Reginald's discrimination. Every word carried the weight of authentic pain, even though Calvin and Zara held federal authority. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Reginald Ashford sat in his luxury sedan outside another property, speaking confidently to Linda Hayes through his Bluetooth headset. His expensive suit and gold watch reflected his belief that discriminatory evictions had made him untouchable. "Linda, tomorrow morning we finish the Brooks situation," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "They're panicking just like the others, making desperate phone calls, begging family for help. It's almost sad how predictable they are." Linda Hayes's voice came through his speakers with less enthusiasm than usual. "Reginald, maybe we should slow down. Thomas mentioned some federal housing investigations in nearby districts. What if someone's paying attention?" Reginald laughed, adjusting his rearview mirror to check his appearance. "Federal investigators don't pose as tenants in rundown apartments, Linda. They wear suits and carry briefcases and announce themselves with official paperwork. These people are just another minority couple who thought they could challenge my authority." His confidence was absolute, built on 4 years of successful discriminations and a justice system that rarely protected vulnerable tenants. He'd evicted 47 families without serious legal challenge, collected hundreds of thousands in discriminatory profits, and built a network of corrupt officials who validated his violations. "Tomorrow at 9 a.m., I want you and Thomas to meet me at their apartment," Reginald continued, already savoring his anticipated victory. "I want them to see official city authority supporting every violation. I want them to understand exactly how powerless they are against the system." Back in the federal building, Detective Santos coordinated with teams positioned around Reginald's properties. Radio communications crackled with professional updates as agents confirmed surveillance positions and arrest readiness. The controlled excitement was building toward tomorrow's operation. Calvin and Zara maintained their tenant personas through the evening, but privately shared the anticipation of agents about to complete a career-defining case. 4 months of careful investigation, systematic evidence collection, and psychological manipulation of their target was about to culminate in federal justice. As midnight approached, Reginald Ashford reviewed his fabricated violation documentation one final time. His trembling hands, which had appeared during yesterday's inspection, were steady now. His confidence had returned completely, He had no idea that federal agents were monitoring his every communication, that his social media posts had been archived as evidence, that his financial records had been subpoenaed, and that his victims had been interviewed by federal investigators. The trap was set perfectly. Reginald's arrogance would drive him forward into federal custody, while his corrupt network would collapse under the weight of overwhelming evidence. Tomorrow would bring justice for Mrs. Dorothy Washington, Marcus Johnson, and every family who'd suffered Reginald's discrimination. The federal government was about to demonstrate that housing discrimination carried serious consequences, even for landlords who believed themselves above the law. Calvin and Zara fell asleep knowing that their undercover work was about to transform into the most satisfying arrest of their careers. The morning sun streamed through the apartment windows, casting sharp shadows across the clean hardwood floors as Calvin Brooks adjusted his green cotton t-shirt and dark jeans. The bright fluorescent overhead lights created perfect visibility throughout the living space, eliminating any corner where deception might hide. He could hear Zara Brooks in the kitchen, her red blouse rustling as she positioned their hidden recording equipment for optimal coverage. The 24-hour deadline Reginald Ashford had imposed was nearly up, and Calvin knew their landlord would return with reinforcements, believing he held all the cards in this elaborate charade. The heavy footsteps in the hallway announced their arrival before the aggressive knocking began. Calvin exchanged a meaningful glance with Zara, who smoothed her red top and black slacks while ensuring the concealed cameras were recording. When Calvin opened the door, Reginald Ashford stood flanked by two companions, his chest puffed with artificial confidence that hadn't been present during yesterday's desperate solo performance. "Mr. Brooks, Mrs. Brooks," Reginald announced with theatrical authority, "I've brought official city representation to document these serious violations." He gestured toward a nervous-looking man in his 50s, wearing a wrinkled blue jacket over an orange shirt and khaki pants. "This is Thomas Wright, City Housing Inspector, and Linda Hayes, my property manager." Linda Hayes appeared uncomfortable in her red blazer and black skirt, her eyes darting around the spotless apartment with obvious confusion. Calvin noticed immediately how Thomas Wright's hands trembled slightly as he clutched his clipboard, and how Linda Hayes seemed reluctant to step fully into the apartment. Something was wrong with Reginald's support team, though Calvin couldn't identify the specific threat they posed to his and Zara's carefully maintained cover. "Gentlemen, ma'am," Calvin said with measured politeness, "we appreciate official oversight of these claimed violations. Yesterday's inspection raised several questions about the accuracy of Mr. Ashford's assessments." Zara moved to stand beside her husband, her hidden recording device capturing every word and gesture as the fluorescent lights illuminated the entire scene with crystal clarity. Reginald's confidence seemed to surge with his official backup present. "Mr. Wright, please document the electrical hazards I identified yesterday. The wiring throughout this unit poses immediate safety risks to neighboring properties." Thomas Wright reluctantly approached the electrical outlets, his inspection cursory and obviously uncomfortable. The wiring was completely code-compliant, recently inspected, and functioning perfectly. "What specific electrical code violations do you see, Mr. Wright?" Zara asked with genuine curiosity, her red blouse catching the overhead light as she leaned forward attentively. "As tenants, we want to understand the technical details of these safety concerns." Thomas Wright's face flushed as he stammered through vague references to potential overload situations without citing actual code numbers or specific violations. Calvin watched Reginald's jaw tighten as his official inspector failed to provide convincing technical support. "The violations are obvious to trained professionals," Reginald snapped, his earlier confidence wavering. "Mr. Wright, please also examine the plumbing irregularities I documented." Linda Hayes shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that the bathroom and kitchen plumbing functioned flawlessly. "Mr. Ashford," Calvin interjected calmly, "could you provide the official documentation for each violation? Building code citations, specific regulatory references, and the legal authority under which you're conducting this inspection? The request was reasonable and professional, but Calvin could see it struck Reginald like a physical blow. Official documentation would require real violations and legitimate authority. Zara positioned herself to capture Reginald's response with multiple hidden cameras as he fumbled through his briefcase. "The documentation is being prepared according to city protocols," he replied tersely, though sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Linda, please note the additional structural concerns I'm observing today." Linda Hayes reluctantly pulled out a notepad, but her reluctance was obvious to everyone present. "Mr. Ashford, the structural elements appear sound to my observation," she said carefully, her red blazer reflecting the fluorescent light as she gestured toward the solid walls and ceiling. "Perhaps we should conduct a more thorough assessment before proceeding with violations." The suggestion clearly frustrated Reginald, who was counting on overwhelming official support to intimidate Calvin and Zara into compliance. "Ms. Hayes, your job is to document violations, not question my professional assessment," he retorted sharply, causing both Thomas Wright and Linda Hayes to exchange worried glances. Calvin recognized the growing tension within Reginald's team and decided to apply additional pressure. "Mr. Wright, in your professional opinion as a city inspector, what's the timeline for correcting these electrical hazards, and what permits would be required for the remediation work?" The question demanded technical knowledge that Thomas Wright clearly didn't possess, and his stammered response revealed his inadequacy to everyone present. "The timeline depends on various factors," Thomas Wright replied weakly, consulting his clipboard as if it contained answers that clearly weren't there. "Permit requirements vary based on the scope of necessary corrections." His non-answer satisfied nobody, and Calvin could see Reginald's frustration mounting as his official support crumbled under basic scrutiny. Zara pressed the advantage with her own pointed question. "Mr. Ashford, you mentioned plumbing violations. Could you specify which fixtures violate code and reference the applicable municipal regulations?" Her red blouse seemed to glow under the bright overhead lights as she spoke with professional precision that clearly unnerved their landlord. Reginald's response revealed his complete lack of actual building code knowledge. "The plumbing irregularities include improper drainage angles and insufficient water pressure maintenance," he declared, fabricating violations that made no sense to anyone with real construction experience. Calvin had to suppress a smile as Reginald created more fraudulent evidence with every desperate word. "I'm documenting your claims for our records," Calvin announced, pulling out his own notepad and pen. "Improper drainage angles, in which specific locations, and what municipal code governs water pressure maintenance in residential properties?" Each question forced Reginald deeper into fabrication, and Calvin could see the man's growing realization that they weren't intimidated like his previous victims. Thomas Wright cleared his throat nervously and addressed Reginald in a low voice. "Mr. Ashford, perhaps we should postpone this inspection until we can prepare more comprehensive documentation. These tenants are asking very specific technical questions that require detailed responses." The suggestion was reasonable, but Calvin could see it triggered Reginald's arrogance rather than his caution. "Mr. Wright, these violations pose immediate safety hazards that cannot wait for bureaucratic delays," Reginald snapped, his voice rising with frustrated authority. "Linda, prepare eviction documentation citing emergency safety violations requiring immediate tenant relocation." Linda Hayes looked stricken at the illegal order, clearly understanding the legal implications of fraudulent emergency evictions. Zara stepped forward with controlled professional interest. "Emergency evictions require specific legal procedures and tenant protections under state and federal law. Mr. Ashford, what legal counsel has reviewed your emergency authority in this situation?" The question struck at the heart of Reginald's fabricated authority, and Calvin could see panic flickering behind his landlord's angry facade. The apartment's bright fluorescent lighting seemed to intensify as Reginald realized he was trapped between his fraudulent claims and the legal challenges Calvin and Zara were raising. His previous victims had been intimidated into compliance, but these tenants were demanding documentation, citing regulations, and exposing the gaps in his fabricated violations. My legal authority derives from property ownership and municipal safety regulations, Reginald declared, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. Thomas, Linda, complete your documentation immediately. We're proceeding with emergency eviction procedures regardless of tenant objections. His desperate demand for immediate action revealed his growing awareness that prolonged scrutiny would expose his entire scheme. Calvin watched Thomas Wright's hands shake more visibly as he pretended to document violations that didn't exist. Linda Hayes had stopped writing entirely, clearly unwilling to create fraudulent documentation that could result in criminal charges against her personally. Reginald's support team was disintegrating under the pressure of creating fake official records. Mr. Ashford, Calvin said with measured calm that clearly frustrated their landlord. We're documenting your emergency eviction claims for legal review. What specific imminent danger requires bypassing standard tenant protection procedures? The question demanded justification for illegal emergency powers that Reginald obviously didn't possess. Zara moved to document Linda Hayes' reluctance and Thomas Wright's obvious discomfort, both reactions that would provide crucial evidence of Reginald's fraud. We appreciate thorough official oversight, she told them directly, and want to ensure all procedures follow proper legal channels to protect everyone's interests. Her reasonable tone made Reginald's aggressive demands appear even more suspicious and legally questionable. The tension in the brightly lit apartment reached a breaking point as Reginald realized his intimidation tactics were failing completely. Calvin and Zara weren't panicking, weren't begging for more time, and weren't accepting his fabricated authority without challenge. Every question they asked exposed more gaps in his fraudulent claims, and his official support team was clearly uncomfortable with the illegal procedures he was demanding. This is completely unacceptable, Reginald finally exploded, his face flushed with frustrated rage. I'm calling the police to enforce this emergency eviction immediately. You people have exhausted my patience with your ridiculous legal questions and bureaucratic delays. His threat to involve law enforcement was exactly the escalation Calvin and Zara had been anticipating, though they maintained perfect expressions of concerned surprise. Calvin exchanged a quick glance with Zara as Reginald pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. Their landlord's arrogance and desperation were about to trigger the federal response they'd been preparing for months. The bright overhead lights seemed to pulse with anticipation as Reginald dialed, completely unaware that he was about to spring the most elaborate trap of his criminal career. 9011. This is Reginald Ashford requesting police assistance with an emergency eviction at 247 Oak Street, Apartment 3B. I have official city support and need immediate law enforcement backup to remove non-compliant tenants from property with serious safety violations. As Reginald ended his call, Calvin felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with watching a criminal unknowingly seal his own fate. The federal response was about to unfold, and their months of careful investigation were about to pay off in the most spectacular way possible. The fluorescent lights overhead cast their harsh, unforgiving glow across Calvin Brooks's spotless apartment as the sound of multiple footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. Reginald Ashford stood near the kitchen counter, his expensive blue suit jacket slightly wrinkled from his increasingly frantic movements, checking his gold watch with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the power. His white dress shirt showed the first signs of perspiration despite the cool morning air flowing through the windows, and his perfectly polished leather shoes tapped an impatient rhythm against the hardwood floor. They should be here any minute, Reginald Ashford announced to Thomas Wright, the corrupt city inspector who fidgeted nervously by the living room window. Thomas wore his standard issue orange work shirt and dark blue pants, his inspector badge catching the natural skylight that streamed through the apartment's large windows. Linda Hayes, the property manager, stood awkwardly near the door in her red blouse and black slacks, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest as if it could shield her from the growing tension in the room. Calvin Brooks maintained his position near the dining table, his green polo shirt and dark jeans giving him the appearance of a concerned tenant facing an impossible situation. His wife Zara Brooks sat on the couch in her red sweater and blue jeans, her smartphone discreetly positioned to capture every moment of what was about to unfold. The morning sun continued to pour through the windows, illuminating every corner of their immaculate apartment and making Reginald Ashford's fabricated violations appear even more ridiculous. The knock at the door came with the authoritative cadence that Reginald Ashford had been waiting for. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his jacket, and moved toward the entrance with renewed arrogance. Finally, he muttered, reaching for the door handle, "Time to end this charade and get you people out of my building." But as the door swung open, Reginald Ashford's confident expression began to falter. Instead of the single uniformed officer he had requested for a simple eviction assistance call, he found himself facing a woman in a professional blue jacket over an orange blouse, her federal badge clearly visible on her belt. Detective Maria Santos stepped into the apartment, followed by 3 additional federal agents, all wearing similar professional attire that immediately distinguished them from local law enforcement. "Mr. Ashford," Detective Maria Santos said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of federal law enforcement. "I'm Detective Santos with the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Inspector General. We need to have a conversation." The color began to drain from Reginald Ashford's face as he processed the unexpected development. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air, while his eyes darted between the federal agents and the tenants he had been so determined to evict. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter, casting sharp shadows that emphasized every line of confusion and growing fear etched across his features. Calvin Brooks rose from his position near the dining table, his movements deliberate and confident as he reached into his back pocket. The small leather wallet he withdrew gleamed under the overhead lights as he flipped it open, revealing the official badge and identification that had remained hidden for 4 long months. "Mr. Ashford," Calvin Brooks said, his voice now carrying a completely different tone of authority. "I'm Calvin Brooks, Special Investigator with the Department of Housing and Urban Development." Simultaneously, Zara Brooks stood from the couch, her own badge appearing in her hand with practiced precision. "And I'm Zara Brooks, also with HUD's Fair Housing Investigation Division," she announced, her smartphone now openly recording every moment of Reginald Ashford's rapidly changing expression. "We've been conducting an undercover investigation into your rental practices for the past 4 months." The transformation in Reginald Ashford's appearance was immediate and dramatic. His face, which had been flushed with confidence and aggression just moments before, now turned ashen gray. His hands, which had been gesturing expansively as he fabricated violations throughout the apartment, began to tremble uncontrollably. The expensive fabric of his blue suit jacket suddenly seemed to hang loosely on his frame as his entire body appeared to shrink in on itself. What are you talking about?" Reginald Ashford stammered, his voice cracking like that of a teenager going through puberty. This is impossible. You're tenants. You've been paying rent. You've been complaining about maintenance issues. This can't be real." Calvin Brooks moved closer, his professional demeanor now fully revealed as he began to speak with the measured cadence of a federal investigator reading charges. "Mr. Reginald Ashford, you are under investigation for multiple violations of the Fair Housing Act, mail fraud, conspiracy to discriminate against protected classes, and racketeering in connection with a systematic pattern of housing discrimination. You have been targeting federal investigators for 4 months, while we documented your criminal enterprise." The weight of Calvin Brooks's words seemed to physically impact Reginald Ashford, whose trembling intensified as the magnitude of his situation became clear. His expensive leather shoes shuffled backward until his back pressed against the apartment wall, the same wall he had been photographing minutes earlier while claiming it showed structural damage. The natural skylight streaming through the windows illuminated his face with merciless clarity, revealing every drop of sweat that now beaded across his forehead. Zara Brooks approached with a large manila envelope, her red sweater bright under the fluorescent lights, as she began removing document after document. "Every interaction we've had with you has been recorded and documented," she announced, spreading photographs and reports across the dining table. "Every fabricated violation, every discriminatory comment, every illegal eviction notice. 4 months of evidence showing your systematic targeting of minority families across 6 different properties." Thomas Wright, who had remained silent near the window, suddenly found his voice. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his orange work shirt darkening with perspiration as he raised his hands defensively. "I'm just a city inspector doing my job. I don't know anything about any discrimination or federal investigations. Mr. Ashford called me here for a routine inspection." Detective Maria Santos turned her attention to the corrupt inspector, her blue jacket catching the morning light as she moved. "Mr. Wright, we have documented evidence of your participation in fraudulent inspections at multiple properties. Phone records show 17 calls between you and Mr. Ashford in the past month alone, coordinating fake violations to support illegal evictions. You're as much a part of this conspiracy as anyone else." Linda Hayes pressed herself closer to the door, her red blouse bright against the white wall as she desperately tried to distance herself from the unfolding federal investigation. "I just manage properties," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't make the decisions about evictions. I just do what Mr. Ashford tells me to do." "Ms. Hayes," Zara Brooks said, consulting her documentation, "you personally delivered fraudulent eviction notices to 7 families in the past 6 months. Our investigation shows you were aware these notices were based on fabricated violations because you helped create the false documentation. Your cooperation in this conspiracy is thoroughly documented." Reginald Ashford's breathing became shallow and rapid as he listened to the scope of evidence being presented against him. His trembling hands clutched at his blue jacket, trying to steady himself against the overwhelming reality of his situation. The confident, arrogant landlord who had burst into the apartment that morning had completely disappeared, replaced by a terrified man facing the collapse of everything he had built through illegal discrimination. "This investigation extends far beyond this single apartment," Calvin Brooks continued, his voice growing stronger as he detailed the federal case. "We have documented systematic discrimination at properties on Maple Street, Oak Avenue, Pine Boulevard, Cedar Lane, Elm Drive, and Birch Court. Dozens of families illegally evicted, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent fees and penalties, and a clear pattern of targeting minority tenants for discriminatory treatment." The fluorescent lights seemed to pulse with intensity as Detective Maria Santos signaled to her fellow federal agents, who began moving through the apartment with professional efficiency. One agent photographed the spotless walls that Reginald Ashford had claimed showed structural damage, while another documented the perfect plumbing and electrical systems that had been labeled as code violations just minutes earlier. "The recording devices we've had installed throughout this apartment have captured every fraudulent claim you've made," Zara Brooks announced, revealing small cameras and audio equipment that had been hidden in plain sight for months. "Every lie about building codes, every fabricated health violation, every discriminatory comment about minority tenants, all of it recorded in high definition with federal quality audio." Reginald Ashford's legs began to give out, and he slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his expensive suit jacket bunched around his shoulders. His trembling had become so severe that his teeth chattered audibly in the bright apartment. The natural skylight, streaming through the windows, seemed to spotlight his complete psychological breakdown as the full scope of his criminal exposure became undeniable. "How long?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of federal agents securing evidence. How long have you known?" Calvin Brooks looked down at the broken man who had terrorized so many families with illegal evictions. "From the moment we submitted our rental application 4 months ago," he said with quiet authority. "Every phone call, every visit, every fraudulent inspection, every discriminatory action. We've been building a federal case against you since day one." Thomas Wright attempted one final desperate play for innocence. "Look, I can explain everything," he said to Detective Maria Santos, his orange shirt now completely soaked with perspiration. "Maybe there were some mistakes in my inspections, but I never intended to discriminate against anyone. This is all just a big misunderstanding that got out of hand." Detective Maria Santos opened her own folder of evidence, the papers crisp white under the fluorescent lights. "Mr. Wright, we have recordings of you telling Mr. Ashford that you could find violations in any apartment where those people live. Your discriminatory intentions are crystal clear in your own words, recorded during planning meetings for fraudulent inspections." The sound of additional vehicles arriving outside filtered through the apartment windows, and Detective Maria Santos moved to look down at the street. "The property seizure team has arrived," she announced. "Mr. Ashford, federal agents are now securing all 6 properties under investigation, along with your financial records, computer systems, and business documents. This criminal enterprise is being dismantled as we speak." Linda Hayes began crying softly, her red blouse shaking as she sobbed. "I have children," she whispered. "I was just trying to keep my job. Mr. Ashford said if I didn't help with the evictions, he'd fire me and make sure I never worked in property management again." Zara Brooks looked at the frightened woman with professional compassion. "Ms. Hayes, your cooperation with federal investigators could significantly impact your legal situation," she said. "But that's a conversation for after you've been properly advised of your rights and consulted with an attorney." Reginald Ashford remained crumpled against the wall, his trembling now accompanied by a low moaning sound as he rocked back and forth. The expensive gold watch on his wrist caught the light as his hands shook uncontrollably, a stark contrast to the confident timepiece checking he had been doing just minutes earlier. His perfectly styled hair was now disheveled, and his blue jacket had twisted around his shoulders in a way that made him look smaller and more pathetic with each passing moment. "The families you displaced," Calvin Brooks said, his voice carrying the weight of justice finally being served. "Mrs. Dorothy Washington, who you evicted for pet violations despite her never owning a pet. Marcus Johnson, who you forced out with noise complaints that were never filed by any neighbors. The Rodriguez family, the Chen family, the Williams family, and so many others. They're all going to see justice today." Detective Maria Santos produced official federal handcuffs, their metal gleaming under the apartment's bright lighting. "Mr. Ashford, you're under arrest for violations of federal housing discrimination laws," she announced with formal authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the handcuffs clicked around Reginald Ashford's trembling wrists, the transformation was complete. The arrogant, discriminatory landlord who had terrorized minority families across the city was now just a broken man facing the full force of federal justice. His trembling had become so severe that Detective Maria Santos had to help him stand, his expensive leather shoes sliding against the hardwood floor that he would never again enter as a property owner. The fluorescent lights continued to shine down mercilessly as federal agents completed their evidence collection throughout the apartment. Every surface that Reginald Ashford had photographed while fabricating violations was now being documented by federal investigators as proof of his fraudulent claims. The spotless apartment that had served as the stage for his downfall would now serve as evidence in his federal prosecution. Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks watched as their months of undercover work reached its culmination. The systematic discrimination that had destroyed so many families was finally being met with the full power of federal law enforcement. Justice was no longer a distant hope, but an immediate reality, unfolding under the bright lights of the apartment where Reginald Ashford had made his final, fatal mistake. As Detective Maria Santos led the handcuffed and trembling Reginald Ashford toward the door, his blue jacket hanging loosely on his defeated frame, the morning sun continued to stream through the windows with brilliant clarity. The apartment that had served as a federal sting operation was now returning to its true purpose as evidence in a case that would transform housing discrimination enforcement throughout the entire city. The reveal was complete, and justice had finally arrived. The federal building's fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across the polished marble floors as Attorney General Patricia Coleman's heels clicked purposefully through the corridor. Her red blazer and matching skirt commanded immediate attention from every federal agent and prosecutor who stepped aside to let her pass. Calvin Brooks watched through the reinforced glass windows as the most powerful legal authority in the district arrived to personally oversee what had become the largest housing discrimination case in federal court history. Calvin Brooks adjusted his green button-down shirt and dark blue jeans as he stood beside Zara Brooks in the federal prosecutor's office. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated stacks of evidence files that represented 4 months of meticulous undercover work. Zara Brooks wore her signature red blouse and black slacks, her fingers steady as she organized digital recordings and photographic evidence that would destroy Reginald Ashford's criminal enterprise forever. Agent Brooks, the scope of your investigation exceeds every federal housing case I've prosecuted in 20 years, Attorney General Coleman said as she entered the conference room. Her authoritative presence filled the space as federal prosecutors scrambled to present their strongest evidence. Calvin Brooks felt professional satisfaction surge through him as Coleman reviewed file after file of documented violations, each page representing another family illegally displaced by Reginald Ashford's systematic discrimination. Zara Brooks activated her laptop and began displaying the technical evidence they had gathered across 6 properties. Attorney General Coleman, our surveillance captured over 40 hours of discriminatory statements, fabricated lease violations, and coordinated efforts to target minority families specifically, she explained. The overhead fluorescent lights reflected off the laptop screen as damning audio recordings filled the room with Reginald Ashford's voice, celebrating successful evictions and planning future targeting strategies. Down the hall in a sterile interview room, Reginald Ashford sat trembling in his Orange County Jail uniform, his hands shaking as 3 overwhelmed defense attorneys attempted to comprehend the federal charges accumulating against their client. The bright fluorescent lighting made his pale complexion appear almost ghostly as prosecutor after prosecutor entered with additional evidence boxes. His confident swagger from the illegal apartment inspection had completely vanished, replaced by the terrified realization that he had targeted federal investigators for months. Detective Maria Santos coordinated with local police departments across the city as federal warrants were executed simultaneously. Her muscular frame moved efficiently through the federal command center as she directed arrests of Thomas Wright and Linda Hayes. The corrupt city inspector and complicit property manager would face their own federal charges as co-conspirators in Reginald Ashford's housing discrimination network. Calvin Brooks testified to federal investigators about the documented patterns they had discovered across multiple properties. Reginald Ashford specifically targeted families based on race, fabricating lease violations that had no basis in reality, he stated under oath. His testimony revealed how elderly Mrs. Dorothy Washington had been evicted for pet violations despite owning no pets, and how young father Marcus Johnson faced noise complaints that were never filed by any neighbors. The conference room filled with federal agents as Calvin Brooks detailed each discriminatory eviction. Agent Sarah Mitchell wore her standard orange top and blue jacket as she documented testimony. Agent Robert Torres adjusted his green shirt and dark pants while recording Calvin Brooks's account of systematic violations across 6 different properties. Every federal investigator present understood they were witnessing testimony that would reshape housing law enforcement nationwide. Zara Brooks provided technical evidence showing how Reginald Ashford's rental application process systematically screened out minority applicants. Her digital analysis revealed coded language in property advertisements, discriminatory background check practices, and coordinated efforts to steer minority families towards substandard units. The fluorescent lights overhead illuminated spreadsheets and data charts that proved intentional discrimination patterns spanning 3 years of rental operations. The evidence shows calculated profit motives behind every discriminatory eviction, Zara Brooks explained to federal prosecutors. Her red blouse caught the natural skylight streaming through the windows as she presented financial records seized from Reginald Ashford's properties. Each illegal eviction generated thousands of dollars in fraudulent fees, security deposit theft, and inflated damage charges that Reginald Ashford pocketed while destroying families' lives. Federal agents discovered Reginald Ashford's detailed financial records, revealing the true scope of his criminal enterprise. Property seizures uncovered hidden bank accounts containing hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from illegally evicted tenants. His systematic targeting of minority families generated enormous profits through fabricated lease violations, fraudulent inspection fees, and coordinated efforts to gentrify neighborhoods by forcing out longtime residents. Attorney General Coleman reviewed the mounting evidence with growing anger and determination. Fair Housing Act violations, mail fraud, conspiracy to discriminate, racketeering charges, and wire fraud, she announced to the assembled federal team. Each charge carried significant federal prison time, and the combined evidence created an airtight case that would result in decades behind bars for Reginald Ashford and his co-conspirators. The federal prosecutor's office buzzed with activity as plea bargain attempts were immediately rejected. Reginald Ashford's defense attorneys desperately proposed cooperation deals, reduced sentences, and financial restitution packages, but the overwhelming evidence and systematic nature of his crimes eliminated any possibility of leniency. Attorney General Coleman personally ensured that federal prosecutors would seek maximum penalties for every charge. Calvin Brooks watched through security monitors as Reginald Ashford's composure completely collapsed during failed plea negotiations. The man who had terrorized minority families for years now sat powerless in federal custody, his trembling hands unable to hold documents steady as prosecutors detailed the evidence against him. His orange jail uniform seemed to shrink around his diminishing frame as the reality of federal prison time became undeniable. Judge Robert Mitchell reviewed the preliminary case files in his chambers, the natural daylight from tall windows illuminating evidence that shocked even his experienced perspective on housing discrimination cases. His long-sleeved judicial robe rustled as he examined photograph after photograph of fabricated property damage, fraudulent inspection reports, and documented targeting of minority families across multiple properties. The federal courthouse's marble corridors echoed with footsteps as Judge Mitchell's bailiff announced that bail would be denied due to flight risk and the severity of federal charges. Reginald Ashford's wealth, multiple properties, and systematic criminal behavior made him an extreme flight risk who could easily disappear rather than face federal prosecution. His trembling became visible to everyone in the courtroom as the judge's decision condemned him to remain in federal custody pending trial. Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks met with displaced families in a community center conference room, the overhead fluorescent lights creating a welcoming atmosphere as they explained the federal case and coming restitution programs. Mrs. Dorothy Washington wore her blue jacket and listened intently as Calvin Brooks described how federal seizure of Reginald Ashford's properties would generate funds for victim compensation and housing assistance. The federal government will provide restitution for every illegally evicted family. Zara Brooks explained to Marcus Johnson and the other affected tenants. Her red blouse seemed to radiate hope as she detailed housing assistance programs, compensation for damages, and federal oversight that would prevent future discrimination. The natural skylight streaming through the community center windows illuminated faces filled with growing hope and vindication. Young Marcus Johnson held his infant daughter as Calvin Brooks explained how federal seizure would transform Reginald Ashford's discriminatory properties into affordable housing units under government oversight. The systematic criminal enterprise that had destroyed so many lives would become a source of stable, fair housing for the communities Reginald Ashford had targeted. Federal justice would literally transform his stolen wealth into resources for the families he had victimized. Federal agents executed simultaneous seizures of all 6 properties in Reginald Ashford's criminal network. Agent Patricia Wong wore her orange top and blue jacket as she supervised the federal takeover of the apartment complex where Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks had conducted their undercover investigation. Property manager Linda Hayes watched helplessly as federal marshals secured every building, document, and financial record that had facilitated years of housing discrimination. The community center meeting filled with emotional testimony as displaced families shared their experiences with Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks. Elderly Mrs. Dorothy Washington described the trauma of sudden eviction, the financial devastation of losing her security deposit, and the humiliation of being labeled a problem tenant despite decades of perfect rental history. Her blue jacket trembled as she spoke, but her voice grew stronger, knowing that federal justice would hold Reginald Ashford accountable. Calvin Brooks documented each family's testimony for federal restitution calculations. The overhead fluorescent lights illuminated notebook after notebook filled with stories of discriminatory targeting, fabricated violations, and systematic intimidation designed to force minority families from their homes. Every page represented federal evidence that would increase Reginald Ashford's prison sentence and generate additional compensation for his victims. Zara Brooks coordinated with federal housing authorities to establish oversight programs that would prevent future discrimination. Her technical analysis of rental application processes, lease agreement language, and property management practices would become the foundation for new federal regulations protecting minority tenants nationwide. The case would create legal precedent extending far beyond Reginald Ashford's immediate criminal network. Federal prosecutors worked through the evening, preparing formal charges as Attorney General Coleman demanded comprehensive prosecution of every violation. The conference room's fluorescent lights remained bright as legal teams documented each discriminatory eviction, each fabricated lease violation, and each coordinated effort to target minority families. The federal case would become a landmark prosecution, demonstrating zero tolerance for housing discrimination. Thomas Wright's arrest at City Hall created chaos as federal agents discovered additional corruption involving discriminatory property inspections across multiple districts. His short-sleeved inspector uniform was replaced with Orange County Jail clothing as federal investigators uncovered evidence of bribery, fraudulent inspection reports, and systematic collaboration with discriminatory landlords throughout the city. His cooperation with Reginald Ashford represented just the surface of municipal corruption that federal prosecution would expose. Property manager Linda Hayes provided federal investigators with detailed records of Reginald Ashford's discriminatory practices in exchange for reduced sentencing recommendations. Her cooperation revealed additional properties, additional victims, and additional co-conspirators who had facilitated systematic housing discrimination across the metropolitan area. federal agents discovered that Reginald Ashford's criminal enterprise extended far beyond the 6 properties Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks had investigated. The federal building's natural skylights illuminated stacks of evidence boxes as investigators processed financial records, property documents, and rental applications revealing 3 years of systematic discrimination. Each box contained hundreds of pages documenting illegal targeting of minority families, fabricated lease violations, and coordinated efforts to circumvent fair housing protections. The evidence would support federal prosecution lasting months and creating legal precedent protecting tenants nationwide. Calvin Brooks felt deep professional satisfaction as federal seizure orders were executed across Reginald Ashford's criminal network. Their 4 months of undercover work had exposed systematic housing discrimination that destroyed countless families while generating enormous illegal profits. Federal justice would not only punish Reginald Ashford, but transform his criminal enterprise into resources serving the communities he had targeted. As evening approached, the federal courthouse's fluorescent lights continued illuminating legal proceedings that would reshape housing law enforcement. Attorney General Coleman personally supervised charging documents that would send Reginald Ashford to federal prison for decades, while providing comprehensive restitution to his victims. The trembling man who had terrorized minority families now faced the full power of federal justice, his criminal empire seized and his freedom permanently forfeited. The federal case against Reginald Ashford represented more than individual prosecution. It demonstrated federal commitment to protecting housing rights, punishing systematic discrimination, and transforming criminal enterprises into community resources. Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks had triggered federal action that would protect countless future families from discriminatory targeting while ensuring that housing discrimination carried severe federal consequences that would deter future violations nationwide. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the federal building's conference room as Calvin Brooks adjusted his green button-down shirt and navy slacks. Across the polished oak table, Mrs. Dorothy Washington smoothed her red cardigan over matching red slacks, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the restitution documents. The overhead fluorescent lights combined with natural skylight created perfect visibility as Zara Brooks, wearing her red blouse and dark jeans, explained the federal compensation program. Mrs. Washington, the government is providing you with $12,000 for the illegal eviction, plus full relocation assistance to a HUD-approved apartment, Zara said, sliding the paperwork across the table. You'll never have to worry about discriminatory housing practices again. The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Calvin. I lived in that apartment for 8 years. 8 years. And that man threw me out like garbage, claiming I had a pet when I'm allergic to cats. I thought nobody would ever believe me. Calvin leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. We documented everything, Mrs. Washington. Reginald Ashford fabricated those pet violations just like he fabricated violations against us. Your testimony helped us build the case that's going to put him away for a very long time. Through the conference room windows, Calvin could see the bustling city below, where dozens of other families had suffered similar fates. The magnitude of Reginald Ashford's systematic discrimination was becoming clearer each day as more victims came forward. Detective Maria Santos entered the room wearing her standard-issue long-sleeved police uniform, carrying a thick manila folder. We have good news about Marcus Johnson's family. The federal relocation program found them a 3-bedroom apartment in Riverside Heights, and Marcus starts his new job at the community center next week. Zara smiled, feeling the warm satisfaction of justice beginning to heal wounded lives. That's wonderful. His children deserve stability after what Reginald put them through. Mrs. Washington wiped her eyes with a tissue. That young man worked 2 jobs just to pay rent, and that landlord evicted him for noise complaints that never happened. I lived in the apartment below theirs. Those children were quiet as church mice. Calvin opened his laptop, the screen illuminating his focused expression. Mrs. Washington, your experience wasn't isolated. We've identified 17 other families across 6 properties who suffered illegal evictions. The pattern is identical in every case. Detective Santos sat down, spreading photographs across the table. The media attention is unprecedented. Channel 7 ran a week-long series on housing discrimination. The mayor's office is getting hundreds of calls from tenants reporting suspicious evictions. Community awareness was always our goal, Zara said, organizing the federal documents. When landlords know the public is watching, when tenants understand their rights, discrimination becomes much harder to hide. Calvin pulled up a spreadsheet showing their expanding investigation. Housing advocacy groups across the city are partnering with us. The Fair Housing Coalition identified 12 more suspicious landlords using Reginald's exact methods. Mrs. Washington studied the photographs, her expression growing more determined. All these families look like me and Marcus, all Black and Hispanic families. That man targeted us specifically. Exactly, Calvin confirmed. Federal prosecutors are arguing this was systematic racial discrimination, not random violations. The evidence supports criminal conspiracy charges. Detective Santos opened her folder, revealing surveillance photos from multiple properties. The community response has been remarkable. Neighbors are coming forward with information about intimidation tactics, fabricated complaints, and coordinated harassment campaigns. Zara felt a surge of hope as she watched Mrs. Washington's transformation from victim to advocate. The federal oversight programs we're implementing will prevent this from happening to future tenants. Every rental property inspection will have independent verification. My granddaughter called yesterday, Mrs. Washington said, her voice growing stronger. She heard about the case on social media. Young people are sharing information about tenant rights, warning each other about discriminatory landlords. Calvin nodded, recognizing the ripple effect they had hoped to create. Social media amplifies awareness faster than traditional advocacy ever could. When one person shares their story, hundreds of others realize they're not alone. Through the conference room door, Calvin could see Marcus Johnson arriving with his 2 children, both wearing bright orange shirts and blue jeans. The young father looked healthier than when they first met him during their undercover investigation, his shoulders no longer carrying the weight of desperate uncertainty. The psychological impact of illegal eviction extends far beyond losing housing, Zara explained to Mrs. Washington. Families lose trust in institutions, children experience trauma from sudden displacement, and communities become fractured by fear. Detective Santos pulled out her phone, showing news coverage from the past week. Channel 12 interviewed Linda Hayes yesterday. She's cooperating fully with federal investigators, providing evidence against 3 other landlords using similar discrimination tactics. Calvin felt satisfaction, knowing their investigation was expanding beyond Reginald Ashford. Linda's testimony revealed a network of property managers sharing strategies for pushing out minority tenants. The federal task force is building cases against the entire system. Mrs. Washington straightened in her chair, her red cardigan catching the fluorescent light. I want to testify at that man's trial. I want the judge to understand how his lies destroyed my sense of home. Your testimony will be powerful, Zara assured her. Federal prosecutors are building victim impact statements that show the full scope of community damage. Marcus Johnson knocked on the conference room door, his children peeking around his legs with shy curiosity. Calvin waved them in, watching as the family dynamic had improved dramatically since their illegal eviction ordeal ended. Mr. Johnson, perfect timing, Detective Santos said, standing to greet them. We were just discussing the community support programs launching next month. Marcus wore a green polo shirt and navy slacks, his appearance professional and confident. The community center job is exactly what I needed. Working with at-risk youth, helping families navigate housing assistance programs. His daughter, about 7 years old, tugged on her orange t-shirt and whispered something to her younger brother. Both children seemed more relaxed than during their previous meetings, no longer carrying the anxiety of housing insecurity. The federal restitution covered moving expenses and security deposits, Marcus explained to Mrs. Washington. But more importantly, the investigation validated everything we experienced. We weren't crazy. We weren't making it up. Zara watched the interaction between Mrs. Washington and Marcus, seeing how shared experience created community bonds. That validation is crucial for healing. Victims of systematic discrimination often blame themselves. Calvin opened another file on his laptop, showing the broader investigation results. Thomas Wright, the corrupt city inspector, faces federal charges for falsifying violation reports. His cooperation revealed similar corruption in 3 other districts. Detective Santos checked her watch, noting the preliminary hearing schedule. Judge Mitchell is reviewing pretrial motions this afternoon. Reginald's defense team is trying to exclude community impact testimony, but federal prosecutors are confident it will be admitted. Mrs. Washington reached across the table, patting Marcus's hand. We're going to see that man face justice for what he did to our families. The legal precedent this case establishes will protect future tenants, Zara said, feeling the weight of their broader mission. Federal courts rarely see housing discrimination cases with this level of documented evidence. Calvin scrolled through emails from housing advocacy groups nationwide. Organizations in 12 states are requesting consultation on similar investigations. The methodology we developed is being replicated across the country. Marcus's son, about 5 years old, looked around the official conference room with wide eyes. His sister whispered explanations about the important adults helping their family, her understanding of justice developing through direct experience. Community healing requires accountability, Calvin continued. When discriminatory landlords face real consequences, when victims receive genuine restitution, trust in institutions can begin to rebuild. Detective Santos gathered her photographs, preparing for the afternoon court session. Media coverage has generated over 300 tips about suspicious evictions. The federal task force is prioritizing cases involving elderly tenants and families with children. Mrs. Washington adjusted her red cardigan, her posture reflecting newfound dignity. I lived through segregation, housing redlining, and decades of subtle discrimination, but this feels different. This feels like real change. Zara smiled, understanding the historical context of their work. Federal enforcement sends a message that housing discrimination will not be tolerated. Communities are watching how the justice system responds. Calvin closed his laptop, satisfied with the morning's progress. The preliminary hearing will demonstrate the strength of our evidence. Reginald Ashford will face testimony from every family he illegally evicted. Marcus stood up, his children flanking him protectively. We'll be there. Mrs. Washington taught me that staying silent allows discrimination to continue. Speaking up protects the next family. Community solidarity is our strongest weapon against systematic discrimination, Detective Santos observed. When victims support each other, when neighbors pay attention, predatory landlords lose their power. Mrs. Washington gathered her restitution paperwork, her movements deliberate and proud. That man thought he could intimidate an old woman into disappearing quietly. He never imagined I'd help bring down his entire operation. Calvin felt the emotional satisfaction of justice beginning to unfold. Their undercover investigation had not only captured one discriminatory landlord, but had sparked a community-wide awakening about tenant rights and housing justice. The federal oversight programs launching next month will include community reporting systems, Zara explained. Tenants can document suspicious behavior, advocacy groups can track patterns, and federal investigators can respond quickly to emerging discrimination. As the meeting concluded, Calvin watched Mrs. Washington and Marcus exchange contact information, their shared experience creating lasting bonds. The ripple effects of Reginald Ashford's crimes were transforming into ripple effects of community empowerment and systematic reform. The afternoon preliminary hearing would mark another step toward full accountability. But the real victory was already visible in the strengthened community, the empowered families, and the federal systems now protecting vulnerable tenants across the country. The federal courthouse stands illuminated under the bright morning sun, its limestone columns casting sharp shadows across the entrance steps. Inside, fluorescent lights flood the courtroom, where Judge Robert Mitchell prepares to deliver sentences that will reshape housing justice in the city. Calvin Brooks adjusts his navy blue suit jacket as he sits in the gallery, watching Reginald Ashford's trembling hands fidget with his Orange County Jail uniform. After 4 months of undercover work and 6 months of federal prosecution, this moment carries the weight of dozens of displaced families and systematic discrimination finally brought to light. Calvin Brooks glances at his wife Zara Brooks, her red blouse catching the courtroom's bright lighting as she reviews her testimony notes one final time. Behind them, Mrs. Dorothy Washington sits quietly in her blue jacket, her weathered hands folded as she waits to see justice for her illegal eviction. Marcus Johnson occupies the row behind her, his green shirt and dark pants pressed for this crucial day, his young daughter fidgeting beside him as history unfolds in real time. Judge Mitchell enters the courtroom, his black robes flowing as he takes his position behind the bench. The overhead lights seem to intensify as he calls the court to order, his voice carrying the authority of federal justice. Reginald Ashford's defense attorney makes one final plea for leniency, but the mountain of evidence Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks gathered during their undercover investigation makes any mitigation nearly impossible. "Mr. Ashford," Judge Mitchell begins, his voice cutting through the courtroom silence, "you stand convicted of systematic housing discrimination, mail fraud, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and racketeering under federal law. Your actions displaced dozens of families based solely on their race and ethnicity, creating a pattern of abuse that strikes at the very heart of fair housing protections." Calvin Brooks feels a surge of vindication as he watches Reginald Ashford's composure finally crumble completely. The man who had burst into their apartment with fabricated violations and false authority now trembles uncontrollably as federal consequences rain down upon him. His orange jumpsuit seems to glow under the fluorescent lights, making his complete defeat visible to every person in the courtroom. Judge Mitchell continues reading the charges, each count representing families torn from their homes through calculated deception. Calvin Brooks remembers Mrs. Washington's tears when Reginald Ashford evicted her for pet violations, despite her never owning an animal. He recalls Marcus Johnson's desperate attempts to fight fabricated noise complaints while protecting his young daughter from homelessness. Every fraudulent claim, every illegal eviction, every discriminatory practice now faces federal accountability. The evidence presented by HUD investigators Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks demonstrates a level of systematic discrimination that demands the fullest response from federal law. Judge Mitchell states, nodding toward the couple in the gallery, "Their undercover work exposed not just individual violations, but an entire network of housing discrimination that has operated with impunity for years." Zara Brooks squeezes Calvin's hand as they stand to approach the witness stand for impact testimony. Calvin steps forward first, his confident stride carrying him past Reginald Ashford's hunched figure toward the microphone where he will speak for every family affected by systematic housing discrimination. "Your Honor," Calvin begins, his voice steady and clear under the bright courtroom lighting. "During our 4-month undercover investigation, my wife and I documented violations across 6 properties affecting over 40 families. We witnessed Mr. Ashford target minority tenants with fabricated lease violations, fraudulent inspection reports, and illegal eviction notices designed to circumvent fair housing protections." Calvin details their methodical evidence collection, from hidden recordings of discriminatory statements to documented patterns of selective enforcement. He describes Reginald Ashford's partnership with corrupt City Inspector Thomas Wright and property manager Linda Hayes, creating a network of officials who enabled systematic discrimination through fake violations and rushed evictions. The families affected by these crimes lost more than housing. Calvin continues, his testimony building emotional momentum. They lost stability, security, and faith in the systems designed to protect them. Children were displaced from schools, elderly residents forced into inadequate temporary housing, and working families pushed into homelessness through calculated deception. Zara Brooks takes the stand next, her red blouse bright against the witness chair, as she details the technical evidence that sealed Reginald Ashford's fate. Her testimony reveals months of documented discriminatory practices, from rental applications that targeted minority families to inspection reports that fabricated violations in code-compliant properties. Mr. Ashford's crimes weren't impulsive decisions, Zara explains to the court. They represented systematic targeting of protected classes through carefully planned deception. Our investigation revealed financial motives behind every illegal eviction, with properties sold or re-rented at higher rates immediately after minority families were forced out. Judge Mitchell listens intently as Zara describes their evidence collection, from hidden cameras that captured fraudulent claims to financial records that proved discriminatory intent. The courtroom remained silent except for Reginald Ashford's occasional sniffling as he realizes the overwhelming scope of evidence arrayed against him. After testimony concludes, Judge Mitchell reviews the sentencing guidelines, while Reginald Ashford's trembling intensifies. His defense attorney whispers frantically, but no legal maneuvering can overcome 4 months of federal investigation and documented systematic discrimination across multiple properties. Reginald Ashford, Judge Mitchell announces, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. I hereby sentence you to 15 years in federal prison for housing discrimination, mail fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. You are additionally fined $2 million and ordered to forfeit all properties used in the commission of these crimes. The courtroom erupts in quiet satisfaction as displaced families finally see justice delivered. Calvin Brooks feels profound vindication watching Reginald Ashford's complete collapse, his orange jumpsuit darkening with sweat stains as the full consequences of his discriminatory empire become real. 15 years in federal prison, complete financial ruin, and the seizure of every property he used to target innocent families. Thomas Wright receives his sentence next, 5 years for corruption and conspiracy in facilitating housing discrimination. The former city inspector hangs his head as Judge Mitchell describes how his fake violation reports enabled systematic targeting of minority families across multiple properties. Linda Hayes, who cooperated with federal investigators, receives 18 months and probation for her role in the discriminatory network. Calvin Brooks watches Mrs. Dorothy Washington wipe tears from her eyes as justice finally arrives for her illegal eviction. Marcus Johnson holds his daughter close, explaining that the bad man who forced them from their home will never hurt another family again. The bright fluorescent lights seem to illuminate not just the courtroom, but a path forward toward systemic housing reform. After sentencing, Attorney General Patricia Coleman addresses the media outside the courthouse. Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks flanked beside her as she announces sweeping federal reforms. New oversight programs will monitor rental practices across the region, while strengthened penalties will deter future housing discrimination. The investigation that began in a single apartment now transforms housing protection for entire communities. The work of investigators Calvin and Zara Brooks represents the finest traditions of federal law enforcement. Attorney General Coleman states to assembled reporters, their undercover investigation not only secured justice for affected families, but exposed systematic discrimination that demands comprehensive reform. Calvin Brooks accepts his federal commendation, knowing their work continues beyond this single victory. Housing discrimination persists in communities across the nation, requiring continued vigilance and undercover investigation to protect vulnerable families from systematic targeting. This case establishes legal precedent and enforcement mechanisms that will benefit countless future victims. Federal restitution programs begin immediately, providing displaced families with new housing, moving expenses, and compensation for damages suffered during illegal evictions. Mrs. Dorothy Washington receives assistance finding senior-friendly housing with proper accessibility features, while Marcus Johnson's family moves into a larger apartment with excellent schools nearby. Reginald Ashford's seized properties undergo conversion to federally managed affordable housing, ensuring they serve the communities he tried to displace, rather than generating profits through discrimination. Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks oversee the transition, watching apartments that once housed fabricated violations become homes for families seeking stable, fair housing. The ripple effects extend throughout the city as other landlords face increased scrutiny and housing advocates gain new tools to combat discrimination. Local housing authorities implement stronger oversight mechanisms, while community organizations receive federal funding to assist families facing potential discrimination. Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks prepare for their next undercover assignment, knowing housing discrimination continues in communities across the nation. Their success in this investigation demonstrates how patient, methodical work can expose systematic violations and deliver comprehensive justice for affected families. 3 months after sentencing, Calvin Brooks reviews case files in their new temporary apartment, this time investigating discriminatory lending practices in a different city. Zara Brooks calibrates surveillance equipment as they prepare to assume new identities, knowing their work protecting fair housing never truly ends. The afternoon sun streams through their windows as they discuss strategy for their upcoming investigation. Calvin adjusts his green shirt and dark pants, preparing to become another tenant, seeking fair treatment in housing markets where discrimination often thrives in shadows. Zara checks her red jacket, ensuring their cover identities appear authentic to landlords who might harbor discriminatory intent. Their previous investigation transformed housing oversight throughout the region, but systematic discrimination requires constant vigilance and enforcement. Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks carry forward the lessons learned from Reginald Ashford's prosecution, knowing every successful case creates precedent and protection for vulnerable families seeking nothing more than fair treatment in housing markets. The federal courthouse where Reginald Ashford received his sentence now houses ongoing prosecutions of housing discrimination cases inspired by their investigation. Judge Mitchell continues presiding over fair housing violations, while Attorney General Coleman implements nationwide reforms based on evidence Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks gathered during their undercover work. As they prepare for their next assignment, Calvin Brooks reflects on the families whose lives were transformed by their investigation. Mrs. Dorothy Washington now lives in safe, accessible housing where her age and limited mobility receive proper accommodation. Marcus Johnson's daughter attends excellent schools near their new apartment, her education no longer disrupted by discriminatory evictions. The systematic changes extending from their investigation ensure future families will face stronger protections and swifter justice when housing discrimination occurs. Federal oversight programs monitor rental practices, while enhanced penalties deter landlords from targeting protected classes through fabricated violations and illegal evictions. Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks lock their apartment door, heading toward their next undercover assignment with renewed determination. Housing discrimination may persist in communities across the nation, but their work ensures it faces increasingly sophisticated investigation and comprehensive federal response. Every case they build, every network they expose, every family they protect, advances the cause of housing justice for all Americans seeking fair treatment in rental markets. Their story continues in courtrooms and communities where systematic discrimination hides behind legitimate-appearing business practices. Calvin Brooks and Zara Brooks remain ready to assume new identities, gather evidence, and expose violations wherever housing discrimination threatens families seeking nothing more than safe, stable homes. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.